The shortest war in recorded history was fought in 1896, and it lasted for all of 38 minutes. For such a brief affair, there was plenty of carnage, even if the losses were decidedly lopsided. By contrast, the longest war in history lasted for more than 3 centuries, but nobody was killed in that conflict. Following are 20 things about those and other fascinating but lesser-known warfare facts. The forgotten and brief Anglo-Zanzibar War. In the 19th century, the Sultanate of Zanzibar in what is now Tanzania consisted of the islands of Zanzibar off the East African coast, and the mainland across the water from them. In 1890 the British and Germans divided Zanzibar amongst themselves. Germany got the mainland, while the British got the islands. That same year, the Sultan of Zanzibar accepted a British protectorate, whose terms included the requirement that his successors had to be pre-approved by the British. When the Sultan died in 1893, the British used that provision to install a puppet replacement, Ahmad bin Tawani. He ruled for 3 years, then shortly before noon on August 25, 1896, he died suddenly. It was suspected that his 29-year-old nephew Khalid bin Bargash had poisoned him. Whatever his culpability, Khalid immediately moved into the palace in Zanzibar town, and without British approval as required by the terms of the Protectorate Treaty, he declared himself Sultan. The British preferred a more pliant successor, Hamoud bin Muhammad, so they rushed 3 cruisers, 2 gunboats, 150 Marines, and 900 African soldiers to Zanzibar town, and gave Khalid an ultimatum to vacate the palace by 9 a.m. August 27, or else. He refused, gathered a force of about 2,800 men, and barricaded himself in the palace. When the ultimatum expired on the 27th, the British ships were ordered to open fire, and they commenced a bombardment at 9:02 a.m. The shortest war in history. By 9:40 a.m. the palace and the royal harem next door were on fire. The Sultan's flag had been cut down, and the gunfire ceased. A journalist reported that the Sultan had fled at the first shot with all the leading Arabs, who left their slaves and followers to carry on the fighting, but others stated that he stuck around for a bit longer. However long he stayed, the Sultan was not in the palace by the time the British reached it shortly after the bombardment stopped. Khalid, with dozens of his followers, fled to the German consulate, where he sought refuge. By that afternoon, the British had installed their favorite, Hamoud bin Muhammad, as Sultan in his place. In the war, which lasted roughly 38 minutes, the British expended about 500 artillery shells, 4,100 machine gun rounds, and 1,000 rifle bullets. The Zanzibaris suffered losses of around 500 men and women killed or wounded, while British casualties consisted of a single petty officer, who was injured aboard a warship. The British sought Khalid's extradition, but the Germans granted him asylum and transported him to German East Africa. He fell into British hands during World War I's East Africa campaign, and was exiled to the Seychelles and then St. Helena. He was eventually released and returned to East Africa, where he died in 1927. History's longest war. The longest war in history reportedly lasted for 335, and pitted the Isles of Scilly off England's southwest coast against the Netherlands. Origins date to the English Civil War, when the parliamentarians forced the royalist navy to retreat to the Isles of Scilly. The Netherlands were allied with the parliamentarians, so the royalists preyed upon Dutch ships. Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp arrived in Scilly to demand reparations, but the royalists failed to offer satisfaction. So he declared war on April 17, 1651. Since most of England was in the hands of their parliamentarian allies, the Dutch declaration was limited specifically to the Isles of Scilly. Soon thereafter, the parliamentarians forced the royalist fleet to surrender, and took over Scilly before the Dutch had fired a shot. The Dutch never got around a peace declaration, so technically a state of war continued to exist between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly. In 1986, a historian contacted the Dutch embassy in London to double-check if a peace had ever been signed. None had been. So the Dutch ambassador visited Scilly on April 17, 1986, the 335th anniversary of the declaration of war, to officially end the bloodless conflict. The kid who desperately wanted to be a U.S. Marine. Dan Bullock was born in 1953 in Goldsboro, North Carolina, where he lived until his mother died when Dan was 12 years old, so he and his younger sister moved to Brooklyn to live with their father and stepmother. When Dan was asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, his top 3 picks were a cop, a pilot, or a Marine. He eventually decided to give the Marines a try. However, he did not want to wait until he grew up. In September 1968, 14-year-old Dan headed to a United States Marine Corps recruitment center with a doctored birth certificate. The birth year on the document was altered from 1953 to 1949, which made him 18 old enough to enlist. Although just 14, Dan was big and strong for his age, 5'9" and 160 pounds. He made it through boot camp in Paris Island and became a bona fide Marine. Unfortunately, his tale soon took a turn from the cute to the tragic. Dan Bullock became the youngest American killed in the Vietnam War. After boot camp, U.S. Marine Corps Private First Class Dan Bullock was sent to Vietnam, a war whose insatiable maw was ever hungry for more and more bodies. He arrived in South Vietnam on May 18, 1969, and was assigned to Fox Company 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division as a rifleman. He ended up in Quang Nam Province, and was stationed in an Hoa combat base, about 25 miles southwest of Da Nang. By then he was all of 15. Dan was big for his age, but he was still a boy in every regard. Surrounded by men, he kept to himself and his comrades noticed. Assigned base security duties, he was in a bunker with 3 other Marines on the night of June 6, 1969, when North Vietnamese sappers stealthily crept under the wire that surrounded the base. They got close enough to Dan's bunker to toss a satchel charged through a slit. The explosion killed all 4 occupants. Dan Bullock was the youngest American killed in the Vietnam War, or since World War I for that matter. A remarkable World War II heroine. Princess Noor Inayat Khan, born in Moscow in 1914 into an unusual family, was one of the most remarkable women of World War II. Her father Inayat Khan was a Sufi master and Muslim noble, descended from the royal family of 18th-century Indian monarch Tipu Sultan. He earned his living as a musician and teacher of Sufism. Noor's mother Purani Amina Begum was born Aura Ray Baker, an American from Albuquerque, New Mexico. The couple met in New York City and fell in love. When her guardian forbade her from seeing Inayat, Noor's mother sailed to London and married him there. When she was still an infant, Noor's parents left Moscow for London, where they lived during World War I. After the war, they relocated to France. As a child, Noor was described as sensitive, shy, quiet, and dreamy. There was no hint that she would someday join the Special Operations Executive (SOE), a secret organization tasked by Winston Churchill with setting Europe ablaze, or secretly infiltrate into German-occupied on a clandestine mission against the Nazis. Raised a pacifist, this woman set pacifism aside to fight the Nazis. Princess Noor Inayat Khan studied music at the Paris Conservatory and became an accomplished harpist and pianist, as well as a virtuoso on the veena, a stringed Indian musical instrument. She also studied child psychology at the Sorbonne. She also became an accomplished poet, wrote children's stories, was regularly featured in children's magazines, and was frequently heard on French radio. Noor did all that before she was 25 years old. When the Germans invaded and overran France in 1940, she and her family fled to Britain. Although she had been raised a pacifist, Noor and her younger brother Vilayat decided to set their pacifism aside in order to fight Nazism. In November 1940, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAF, as an aircraftwoman second class, and began to train as a wireless operator. It was mind-numbingly tedious work, so to relieve the boredom, she applied for a commission in 1941, in the hope that she might get a more interesting assignment. The assignment she got was extremely interesting. The first female Sioux wireless operator in Nazi-occupied France. British intelligence caught wind of Noor Inayat Khan's request for a more challenging assignment, and they were more than happy to oblige her. She had grown up in France and was fluent in French. That made her quite a catch for the British, who faced a severe shortage of French speakers. So she was recruited by the French section of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and in early 1943, was sent to train as a clandestine wireless operator behind enemy lines. The fact that she had been previously trained as a wireless operator gave her an edge, and head start over other trainees. Noor was not the first Sioux woman sent to France. However, the Muslim princess was the first Sioux woman who was infiltrated into France as a wireless operator. The other women sent before her had all been couriers. Noor's job was to maintain a link between the resistance in France and the Allies in London, and send and receive messages to coordinate activities. A hazardous job of a clandestine wireless operator. Princess Noor Inayat Khan's mission as a clandestine wireless operator in German-occupied France was extremely hazardous. It grew ever more dangerous as the war progressed, and the Germans' ability to detect transmissions rapidly improved. Clandestine wireless operators had to hide as best they could as they tapped out messages in code and string up aerials disguised as clotheslines in attics. They then had to wait, sometimes for hours, for a reply, or at least an acknowledgement that their message had been received. As they did that, German signal vans were on constant patrol to try and pick up and triangulate the location of clandestine transmissions. A wireless operator who stayed on the air for too long could lead the Germans straight to his or her location, so wireless operators like Noor had to constantly move around and fled from transmission site to transmission site as inconspicuously as they could. That was no small feat. German military patrols, the Gestapo, and collaborationist French police frequently stopped and searched people, and back then transmitters were bulky contraptions that filled a suitcase. In 1943, when Noor accepted her assignment, the life expectancy of a clandestine wireless operator in Nazi territory was just 6 weeks. A princess infiltrates Nazi-occupied France. In the dark of the night of June 16 to 17, 1943, Assistant Section Officer Noor Inayat Khan was infiltrated into Nazi-occupied France, codenamed Madeleine and furnished with fake identity documents that named her as Jean-Marie Régnier. She boarded a black-painted Westland Lysander. It flew her and 2 other female Sioux agents to a clandestine airfield in the countryside. There they were met by French Sioux agent Henri Dericourt, who coordinated air operations between Britain and clandestine networks on the ground in France. Dericourt's service with the Sioux was controversial. After the war, accusations were made that he had been a traitor and double agent. It was alleged that he had worked for the Sicherheitsdienst SD, the intelligence arm of the Nazi SS, and that he had betrayed numerous Sioux agents and French resistance members to the Germans. He was tried on the charges and was acquitted. However, suspicions lingered and surrounded him to the end of his life. They included suspicions that he had betrayed Noor Inayat Khan. The tragic end of a war heroine. Although the average life expectancy of a clandestine wireless operator in German-occupied France was 6 weeks, Assistant Section Officer Noor Inayat Khan survived for longer than that. She arrived in mid-June 1943 and lasted for nearly 4 months before she was arrested by the SD on October 13, 1943. She was betrayed to the Germans either by Henri Dericourt or a female agent named Renée Gary, who was driven by jealousy because her love interest was attracted to Noor. Along with Noor, the Germans captured documents that allowed them to mount a counterintelligence operation that nabbed 3 more Sioux agents. Noor escaped her imprisonment twice but was recaptured. After the second attempt, she was classified as a dangerous prisoner and was kept in solitary confinement with her hands and feet in shackles. Despite harsh conditions and harsher interrogations, Noor refused to give the Nazis anything. After 10 months of cruel confinement, she was sent to Dachau concentration camp, where she was brutally beaten by an SS officer before she was shot to death on September 13, 1944. An inmate who witnessed her death stated that her last words were "Liberté." After the war, Noor Inayat Khan was posthumously awarded the British George Cross and the French Croix de Guerre. A great Pharaoh's preparations for war. Ramses II fought the Battle of Kadesh in 1274, earliest battle in recorded history, for which details such as tactics and formations are known. 6,000 chariots took part, which also made it the biggest chariot clash in history. It occurred against a backdrop of a generations-long rivalry between Egypt and the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, as they jockeyed to control the lands of Canaan between them. Early in his reign, Ramses II decided to finish off the protracted war once and for all. Over a period of years, he patiently assembled a powerful army and built up supply depots. When all was ready, he marched north from Egypt into Canaan with 4 divisions. First was the Ammon division, led by Ramses in person, followed by the divisions of Re, Ptah, and Sutek. When he heard the news, the Hittite king Muad Ali II marched south from Anatolia into Canaan, with 3,000 heavy chariots and 8,000 infantry. In the late spring of 1274 BC, Ramses emerged from the hills above the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River, near today's Lebanon-Syria border, without having spotted the Hittites. They were far closer than he knew. An indecisive battle depicted as a decisive victory. The Hittites were hidden behind Kadesh when Ramses II reached the city. But nomads falsely informed the pharaoh that his enemies were nowhere near. Emboldened, Ramses hurried with the Amman division to Kadesh, and left the rest of his army behind to catch up. As Ramses advanced, the Hittites circled around the city, and made sure to keep Kadesh between themselves and the Egyptians as they did so. While Ramses and the division of Amman made camp, a division of Re straggled up the road behind. That was when 2,000 massed Hittite chariots charged directly across the Egyptian line of march. They wrecked the division of Re, and surrounded Ramses in his camp. The pharaoh gathered his personal guards, and led a desperate charge that drove some Hittite leaders into the Orontes River. Fortunately for Ramses, the Hittites behind him abandoned their chariots to loot the Egyptian camp. That was when the division of Sutek arrived in the nick of time, and slaughtered the looters. As the Hittite king Muad Ali sent in the rest of his chariots, the last Egyptian division of Ptah arrived, and the battle lasted until sunset. After prolonged slaughter, the Hittites finally withdrew into Kadesh, and left the field in victory to Ramses. Upon his return, the warrior pharaoh littered Egypt with monuments and murals that detailed the engagement, and in which he described himself as Ramses, the great conqueror of the Hittites, which is how we know so much about the battle. A World War I heroine. Heroes and heroines in real life, unlike in comic books and movies, seldom wear capes and tight leotards. In the case of real-life heroine Edith Cavell, she wore a nurse's smock and cap. As a middle-aged woman, Cavell saved hundreds of lives early in the First World War. She was not armed with a gun when she did that. Instead, she was armed and armored by a faith and sense of basic decency that compelled her to help those in need. Also, unlike the fate of heroes and heroines movies and comic books, her story did not end happily, because it happened in real life. And in real life the hero comes to grief more often than not. Edith Cavell's heroism got her executed by a firing squad. Born in 1865 in a small English village in East Anglia, Cavell was the eldest of 4 children of a vicar and his equally religious wife. She received an excellent by the standards of her day, and upon graduation she worked as a governess, including for a family in Brussels from 1890 to 1895. An influential nurse. Edith Cavell left Belgium and returned to England to care for her father. When he became seriously ill, by the time he recovered, Cavell realized that she had discovered what she wanted to do for the rest of her life, become a nurse. So in 1896, she began to train as a nurse and graduated 2 years later. Her early Christian upbringing instilled in her a sense of duty towards those less fortunate than herself, and that led her to apply for work in hospitals that served the poorer parts of London. She was invited back to Brussels in 1907 to become the matron, or chief nurse, of Belgium's first modern school for nurses. By 1910, the energetic Cavell had launched Belgium's first nursing journal, and was training nurses for 3 hospitals, 13 kindergartens and 24 schools. When Germany invaded Belgium in 1914 and kicked off World War I in the West, Cavell was in England on a visit to her mother. She felt that it was her duty to return to Brussels immediately. Acts of mercy, that also happened to be illegal under the laws of war. By August 20, 1914, the Germans had occupied Brussels, and Edith Cavell's nursing school was transformed into a Red Cross hospital that treated soldiers from all sides, as well as civilians. In September 1914, she was asked to help 2 wounded British soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. She treated them, then helped smuggle them out of German-occupied Belgium and across the border into the neutral Netherlands. That was the start of her involvement in a clandestine network that sheltered Allied soldiers and Belgian men of military age, and arranged for their escape from German-occupied territory. In the 11 months that followed, Cavell helped over 200 British, French, and Belgian soldiers and civilians. She sheltered them in her hospital, furnished them with false identity papers, and arranged to smuggle them across the border to safety. As she put it, "I can't stop while there are lives to be saved." Her efforts to help others were honorable, but they were also illegal under the laws of war. The Germans suspected Cavell, but could find no evidence against her, until she was betrayed by a collaborator. She was arrested on August 3, 1915, and imprisoned for 10 weeks, the last 2 in solitary confinement. An angel of mercy who became a saint. When the Germans deposed Edith Cavell, she confessed. She admitted that she had sheltered about 60 British and 15 French soldiers, plus over 100 Belgian and French civilians of military age, then helped smuggle them across the border. Her admission that she had helped enemy soldiers escape to countries at war with Germany sealed her fate. She was tried before a military tribunal, convicted and sentenced to death. Legally, the Germans had every right to execute Cavell, a civilian who helped Germany's enemies in the midst of a declared war. Her protection as a Red Cross nurse was forfeited when she used it as cover to help Germany's foes. Politically, however, the German decision to execute the middle-aged nurse, which was carried out by a firing squad on October 12, 1915, was a public relations disaster. Nurse Cavell became an iconic propaganda figure in Britain. In the then still neutral United States, her execution further sullied Germany's reputation, a reputation already marred by a German U-boat sinking of the Lusitania earlier that year, in which 128 Americans were killed. After the war, Cavell's remains were returned to Britain for a state funeral at Westminster Abbey. To this day, the Church of England commemorates the date of her execution, October 12, on its calendar of saints. A chance find that changed the U.S. Civil War. In the long and tortuous course of the U.S. Civil War, the fall of 1862 might have been the lowest point for the federal government and the Union's cause. The year had started promisingly enough with a campaign that sought to capture Richmond, but a series of mistakes turned that into a fiasco. Then the Confederates under Robert E. Lee dealt the Federals a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Second Bull Run in August, and early in September, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia invaded Maryland. Things looked bleak, with Britain and France about to recognize the Confederates' independence, when the Union caught an unexpected break. On September 13, as the Army of the Potomac hurried to catch up with Lee's forces, Union Army Corporal Barton Mitchell arrived at a campsite that had been recently vacated by the enemy. As he rummaged around, he found an envelope with 3 cigars wrapped in some papers. The papers turned out to be Special Orders No. 191, in which Lee had spelled out his army's movements. The bloodiest day in American history. Robert E. Lee's Special Orders No. 191 were rocketed up the Army of the Potomac's chain of command until they reached its chief, General George B. McClellan. He was pleasantly surprised to discover that the Confederate Army was spread out, and that fate had gifted him an unexpected golden opportunity to defeat his enemy's scattered units one by one, before they could unite. Unfortunately, McClellan was not the best man to seize golden opportunities, and Lee managed to concentrate his army in the nick of time. The result was a major battle fought in the vicinity of Antietam Creek on September 17, 1862. It was the bloodiest day in American history, with a combined tally of over 22,000 dead, wounded and missing. McClellan had a chance to finish off Lee's army, but failed to do so. Nonetheless, the horrific casualties ended Lee's Maryland campaign and forced him to withdraw and return to Virginia. The Confederates never came as close again to victory in the U.S. Civil War as they did that September of 1862.